Charlotte Whitmore set her wedding ring on the dining table like she was setting down something that had never truly belonged to her. No tears, no trembling hands. Just a woman standing straight in a house that had swallowed 3 years of her life whole. Nathaniel Caldwell watched her from across the room, and for one terrible second he expected her to beg. She didn't. If this story already has your heart pounding, subscribe to our channel and follow Charlotte's journey all the way to the end. And drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Kentucky, summer 1818. The heat came early that year, the kind that settled into the bones of the land and refused to lift, pressing down on the bluegrass hills like a hand flat against a chest. The days ran long and golden, and still the kind of summer that made men feel invincible and made women invisible. Charlotte Whitmore Caldwell had learned to be invisible long before that summer arrived. She'd learned it the way a person learns any skill they never wanted, slowly by necessity, in the space between what she'd hoped marriage would be and what it had actually become. She'd learned to move through Caldwell House quietly, to complete the 100 invisible tasks that kept the estate breathing without ever asking to be thanked for any of them. She'd learned to read a room before she entered it, to gauge her husband's moods by the set of his shoulders, by the way he held his coffee cup, by whether he looked up when she came in, or kept his eyes on whatever was in front of him. Most mornings he kept his eyes on whatever was in front of him. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself a great many things in those 3 years, the way a woman does when the alternative to telling herself things is standing in the middle of what she'd built her life around and admitting it had cracked beneath her feet. The Caldwell estate sat 12 miles east of Harrodsburg, and it was the kind of property that made visitors draw a breath when they saw it from the road. Wide and white against the hills, with horse pastures running down to a creek that never quite dried up, even in the driest summers. Nathaniel Caldwell had inherited it from his father at 22, and he ran it the way he ran most things in his life, efficiently, with the expectation that everything around him would perform according to its purpose, and with very little patience for anything that didn't. Charlotte had performed according to her purpose. She'd managed the household accounts when his steward made errors. She'd remembered which of the field workers had aging mothers, which had children who needed shoes before winter, which had grievances that would fester into something larger if nobody listened. She'd made sure the kitchen ran clean, that the linens were right, that the pantry was stocked before a man even realized he was hungry. She'd done all of it without complaint, without recognition. And she was beginning to understand, without being truly seen by the man who shared her name. What she hadn't done, what she had never done, was give him any reason not to trust her. Which made the night of July the 14th, 1818, the most incomprehensible night of her life. The dinner party had been Nathaniel's idea. He entertained regularly that summer, the way men of his standing did large gatherings, important names, long tables laid with silver. Charlotte had organized the guest list, consulted with the cook, arranged the flowers herself, because the woman Nathaniel had hired to handle arrangements had a tendency toward ostentation that Charlotte knew her husband's guests would quietly mock. She'd pressed her blue silk carefully, pinned her hair the way she knew looked well, and come downstairs prepared to spend 3 hours being the invisible engine behind a dinner that everyone would compliment Nathaniel on running beautifully. The guests arrived in the long summer evening: merchants from Harrodsburg, a judge and his wife from Danville, a minister, 2 of Nathaniel's business associates from Louisville, and Amelia Harrington. Charlotte had known Amelia Harrington existed the way she knew certain weather was coming. You could feel it in the air before you could see the clouds. Amelia was 27, the only daughter of a wealthy merchant family, 2 counties over, and she'd made no secret in local society that she'd had an interest in Nathaniel Caldwell before Charlotte had come into the picture. She was beautiful in a particular way that made other women tired, effortlessly, expensively beautiful, with dark eyes that knew exactly what they were doing, and a smile she aimed like an instrument. She arrived on her father's arm and went directly to Nathaniel. Charlotte watched from across the room and felt nothing she could name clearly. Only a low, formless awareness, like the feeling before a storm. The dinner was fine. The food was good. The conversation flowed the way it was meant to. Charlotte said the right things to the right people, laughed at the appropriate moments, kept the table moving, and the wine poured without anyone noticing she was doing any of it. Amelia Harrington laughed more loudly than necessary and placed her hand on Nathaniel's arm twice during the meal, which was twice more than was proper. And Charlotte watched her husband's face when she did it. He didn't pull away. Afterward, in the parlor, while the men drank and the women assembled near the window to take advantage of whatever thin breeze was moving off the hill, Charlotte heard Amelia Harrington's voice drop the way voices drop when someone wants to be overheard without appearing to be. "I do feel for him," Amelia said, not to Charlotte. To Mrs. Danvers, the judge's wife, in that particular tone women use when they want information to travel. "A man in his position with a wife who, well, I suppose it isn't charitable to say." Mrs. Danvers, who had the social instincts of a hunting dog, leaned in immediately. "What have you heard?" "Nothing I'd repeat without more certainty," Amelia said, which was the most efficient way possible of ensuring everyone would ask her to repeat it. "Only that someone saw her in Harrodsburg last month, with a man. Someone who was not Mr. Caldwell." Charlotte went still. The room didn't stop. Voices kept moving. Glass clinked against glass. A woman near the fireplace laughed at something. But Charlotte had gone to a particular kind of stillness inside herself, the stillness of a person who has heard something impossible and is waiting for the air to correct itself. She turned. She looked at Amelia Harrington directly. Amelia met her eyes with perfect composure and smiled. Charlotte crossed the room. She did it quietly without rushing, because rushing would have looked like panic, and she would not give Amelia Harrington the satisfaction of her panic. She reached the small circle near the window and said with a steadiness she was genuinely surprised to find she had, "I wonder if you might repeat that, Miss Harrington, clearly enough for me to hear." The circle of women went very quiet. Mrs. Danvers looked between them with the expression of someone who has just realized they've stumbled into something far more interesting than they expected. Amelia's smile didn't waver. "I was simply expressing concern, Charlotte. A man of Nathaniel's standing, people notice things. I'm sure whatever they saw was perfectly innocent." "What did they see?" Charlotte said. It wasn't a question. "A woman matching your description," Amelia said pleasantly, "leaving the hardware merchants on the east side of town, in the company of a man none of them recognized. Quite close company from what I understand." Charlotte held very still. She knew exactly where she'd been in Harrodsburg last month. She'd gone to collect a measurement order for new fencing supplies and had run into her father's nephew, her cousin Thomas, who'd been traveling through Kentucky on his way west and had stopped to say hello. They'd walked half a block together. Thomas was family. Thomas had a wife and 3 children. Thomas had shaken her hand goodbye and gone on his way. There was nothing to explain. And yet she could feel in the way that women who have lived alongside the architecture of reputation understand it that explanation was already beside the point. The story was already moving. It had left Amelia Harrington's mouth and entered the room's bloodstream, and the only thing that would determine whether it killed her or not was whether Nathaniel Caldwell believed her when she told him the truth. She excused herself from the circle. She went to find her husband. She found him in the front hallway with 2 of his business associates, all 3 of them with glasses in hand and the particular ease of men who were comfortable with one another and with the world at large. He looked up when she approached. Something in his face shifted a shuddering, a pulling away, and Charlotte understood with a cold dropping clarity that he had already heard. Of course he had. This was Amelia Harrington's design. "Nathaniel," she said, "may I speak with you?" "Not now, Charlotte." "It won't take long." "I said not now." His voice was quiet, very controlled. The men beside him had the decency to find somewhere else to look, though they didn't leave. Charlotte recognized the social cage of the moment. She could not make a scene, could not press him in company without making things worse for herself, and he knew it. She waited. She waited through the remainder of the evening while the guests finished their drinks and said their goodbyes and filed out into the summer night. She stood near the door and said all the correct things. "Thank you for coming. Lovely evening. Do ride safely." She listened to Amelia Harrington say to her with that same composed smile, "You keep such a beautiful home, Charlotte. You always have." And she heard the past tense of it deliberate as a blade. When the last carriage had gone, and the house had closed around its silence, Charlotte turned to find Nathaniel standing in the middle of the front parlor. He was looking at her. Not the way he usually didn't look at her. This was a looking that had weight behind it, something that had been building all evening in his chest and was now seeking somewhere to land. "Who was he?" Nathaniel said. Charlotte breathed. "He was Thomas Aldridge, my father's nephew, my cousin. He was passing through Kentucky on his way to Missouri, and he stopped to say hello to me on the street. We walked together for 2 minutes. I have known Thomas Aldridge since I was 7 years old, Nathaniel." Silence. "That is the truth," she said. "That is the entirety of it. Amelia says people have been talking about this for weeks. Amelia Harrington," Charlotte said carefully, "has wanted what I have for longer than either of us has been married. I think you know that." Something moved across his face. Not softening, not belief. Something that looked, if she was honest, like a man who had already decided what he believed, and was now performing the conversation for reasons she couldn't entirely understand. "You're accusing her of lying," he said. "I'm telling you the truth. She has no reason to lie." Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. "She has every reason to lie, Nathaniel. You simply refuse to see it, because seeing it would require you to trust me, and you have never—" She stopped, pressed her hands flat against the sides of her skirts, started again. "She wants you. She has always wanted you. She planted this story deliberately, and she planted it tonight because she knew you would hear it in a room full of people before I could explain anything, and that by the time I reached you, it would already feel true." He said nothing. "Thomas Aldridge is family," Charlotte said. "Write to my father if you don't believe me. Write to Thomas's wife in Boston. There are people who can confirm everything I'm telling you in the time it takes a letter to travel. And in the meantime," he said. "In the meantime," Charlotte said, "you choose whether you believe your wife of 3 years or a woman who has been trying to replace her." The silence stretched, and then Nathaniel Caldwell looked at her. Really looked at her in a way he hadn't in months, maybe longer, and something in his expression closed like a door shutting. "I need time to think," he said. "Then think," Charlotte said. "I'll be here." She was there. For 2 weeks she was there. She continued running the house. She continued managing the accounts, overseeing the kitchen, checking on the field workers, all of it, all the invisible labor that kept Caldwell House standing. She ate breakfast across the table from a man who barely spoke to her. She lay in the bedroom they no longer shared in any meaningful way, and stared at the ceiling in the summer dark, and told herself over and over that he would come to his senses. That the truth would reach him. That 3 years of marriage had to mean something. She wrote to her father. She wrote to Thomas's wife in Boston. She waited. On the 15th day, Nathaniel came to find her in the garden. Not the formal garden near the house, but the kitchen garden out back, where she went when she needed somewhere to be alone with her hands and her thoughts. She was cutting herbs, not because she needed them, especially, but because the smell of them made her feel like herself. She heard his boots on the path behind her and didn't turn. "Charlotte?" She turned then. He was standing at the edge of the garden, and he looked not guilty. That was the thing that struck her, standing there with herb stems in her hands in the summer heat. He didn't look like a man who was about to apologize. He looked like a man who had made a decision that cost him nothing. She understood in that moment that the past 2 weeks hadn't been him deliberating. They'd been him convincing himself. "I've been thinking," he said, "about our arrangement." Our arrangement? 3 years of marriage reduced to an arrangement. "Have you?" she said. "I think," Nathaniel said, "that we have both been unhappy for some time, that this marriage has not served either of us the way it should have, and I think—" He stopped, adjusted the word. "I've decided that I no longer need you as my wife, Charlotte." The garden went completely still. She heard a bird somewhere, the creak of the well, the distant sound of someone in the far field. She did not cry. She noticed from a curious distance that she did not cry. There was something inside her that had known this was coming. Not consciously, not in any way she could have named, but known it in the way the body sometimes knows things before the mind has caught up. Her hands were steady. The herbs were still in them. "I see," she said. "I think it's best if you—" He paused again with the discomfort of a man unused to being the one who has to say difficult things directly. "I've spoken to my solicitor. There are arrangements that can be made. You would be provided for." "Provided for?" Charlotte repeated. "Generously," he said, as though the size of the provision was the point. She set the herbs down on the garden wall. She straightened. She looked at her husband of 3 years, really looked at him in the full afternoon light, without the layer of hope or patience or willful blindness that she had been wearing over her eyes for longer than she could precisely calculate. She saw a man who had never truly looked back. "You haven't waited for the letters?" she said quietly. "My father's letter. Thomas's wife in Boston." "Charlotte, you decided," she said. "Not an accusation, just the fact of it laid flat. You had already decided before you walked out here." He said nothing. "And the truth," she said, "would not have changed it." He still said nothing, and his silence was its own answer, the most honest thing he'd offered her in 2 weeks. Charlotte smoothed the front of her dress. A small, precise gesture. She turned and looked at the herb garden for a moment, at the rosemary and the sage, and the small, neat rose she'd put in the ground herself 2 springs ago in the first flush of trying to make this place feel like something that belonged to her. Then she turned back to her husband. "Very well," she said. "Then there's nothing more to say." She walked past him on the garden path. Her shoulder came within a foot of his arm, and she did not look at him as she passed. She went through the kitchen door and up the back stairs and into the bedroom. What had been the bedroom, what would not be hers by tonight, and she began to pack. She was efficient about it. She was efficient the way she'd been efficient about everything in this house, without drama, without waste. She took what was hers. 3 dresses, 2 every day, 1 good. Her mother's Bible. The small wooden box of letters from her family tied with string. A shawl. A pair of boots that were good for walking. A hairbrush. The slim purse of household money she was entitled to as the household manager, what remained of the monthly allowance she'd rarely spent. She did not take the jewelry he'd given her. She left it on the dressing table, laid out neatly. The pearl earbobs, the garnet brooch, the thin gold bracelet from their first anniversary that she had once treasured so much, she'd been afraid to wear it regularly in case she lost it. She left them all. She carried her bag down the front staircase. Nathaniel was standing in the front hall. He hadn't expected her to be done so quickly, she could see that. He looked at the bag in her hand with something that might have been discomfort, or might have been surprise, or might have been the very early edge of something he wasn't ready to call regret. "You don't have to leave tonight," he said. "I think I do," Charlotte said. "Charlotte, the arrangement, the provision. We haven't discussed the particulars." "You can send the particulars to my Aunt Ruth's house in Versailles," she said. "I'll be staying there." He blinked. "You've already—" "I wrote to her a week ago," Charlotte said. "I didn't know for certain I'd need to, but I thought it was wise to know I had somewhere to go." Something moved across his face. Quickly, like a shadow crossing a field, she crossed the front hallway and reached the door, and paused there, not because she was uncertain, but because there was something else. One thing she had not yet done. She reached into the small pocket of her dress and took out her wedding ring. She had put it there that morning, she realized now without quite deciding to. Some part of her had known. She set it on the small table by the door, the one where they left calling cards and afternoon mail. She set it down without ceremony, without drama, the way you set down something that no longer belongs to you. She opened the door. The summer evening hit her full in the face. The heat, the light, the smell of grass and horses, and the wide-open Kentucky air. She stood in the doorway for just a moment. "Goodbye, Mr. Caldwell," she said. She didn't wait for a response. She walked out. And for the first time in 3 years, Charlotte Whitmore, not Charlotte Caldwell, not Mrs. Nathaniel Caldwell, not the mistress of this house, was walking somewhere entirely her own. She didn't look back. She had done many things in her 24 years that had required courage she hadn't known she possessed until the moment it was needed. She'd left her mother's house at 21 to marry a man she'd known for 4 months because her family had thought it a good match, and she had wanted to believe it. She'd learned to manage an estate larger than anything she'd grown up with, learning as she went, asking questions nobody thought to ask her back. She'd sat at the bedside of a field worker's child sick with fever for 2 nights straight because nobody else was going to do it, and the child needed someone there. But she had never been afraid until now. Not afraid of Nathaniel. Not afraid of the future in any dramatic, crumbling way. Afraid of the particular thing that was happening inside her chest as she walked down the Caldwell Estate Drive in the summer evening, with her small bag and her mother's Bible, and the certainty that she had just closed a door that was not going to open again. She was afraid because she didn't know yet whether she was walking toward something or simply away. She walked the 1.5 miles to the crossroads and took the post road north toward Versailles. The light was going golden and long across the fields. A man driving a wagon going the same direction offered her a ride, and she accepted it without pride, sitting on the bench beside a stranger with her bag on her lap and her back straight, and her face arranged into something she hoped looked like calm. The man drove in comfortable silence for a while. Then he said without looking at her, "You doing all right, miss?" "Yes," Charlotte said. "Thank you." "Long way to walk in this heat." "I had some help," she said. He left her at the northern fork, and she walked the last 2 miles to her Aunt Ruth's house as the sun went down behind the hills and the fireflies began to come up out of the grass. By the time she knocked on the white door of the small frame house on Elm Street in Versailles, her feet ached and her throat was dry, and she was holding herself together with something she didn't have a precise name for. Her Aunt Ruth opened the door. Ruth Whitmore was 61 years old, had been widowed at 40, and had subsequently spent 2 decades proving that a woman of moderate means and significant intelligence could build a life worth living on entirely her own terms. She took one look at Charlotte on her doorstep, at the bag, the posture, the expression that was trying to be composed and was mostly succeeding, and stepped aside to let her in without saying a word. Inside, Ruth poured tea. Charlotte sat at the kitchen table and accepted the cup with both hands. "Well," Ruth said, sitting across from her with her own cup. "Tell me." Charlotte told her. She told it straight through, the dinner party. Amelia Harrington, the conversation in the garden, all of it. She told it without dramatic inflection, in the level, precise way she told most things, because she'd found over the years that keeping the telling level was the only way she knew to keep herself level while she did it. When she was done, Ruth was quiet for a moment. "He didn't wait for the letters," Ruth said. "No. He'd made up his mind." "Yes." Ruth turned her cup in her hands. "You did the right thing leaving." "I know," Charlotte said. Then more quietly, "I know. How are you feeling?" Charlotte looked down at the table. "I'm not entirely sure yet," she said honestly. "There's something I keep waiting to feel destroyed, and I feel..." She searched for it. "I feel like a person who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time and has just set it down. And I'm not sure if I'm relieved or if I'm simply exhausted, and I won't know the difference until I've slept." Ruth looked at her for a long moment. "That," she said, "sounds exactly right." Charlotte looked up. "When my William died," Ruth said, "I expected to fall apart. And I did for a little while. But then one morning I woke up and I made my own breakfast, and I sat at this table in my own kitchen, and I decided what I wanted to do that day. And there was something in that, just that small thing, that felt like discovering I was still here, that I had not disappeared." Charlotte was quiet. "You haven't disappeared," Ruth said. "You only just remembered you were still here." Charlotte stared at the familiar kitchen, the dried herbs hanging from the ceiling, the window with the view of the back garden, the worn spot on the wooden floor where Ruth had stood at that stove for 30 years. She had sat at this table as a girl and as a young woman, and it had always felt like safety, like something that stayed itself. "What do I do now?" she said, not in despair, a real question. "You sleep," Ruth said. "Tonight you sleep. Tomorrow we figure out the rest." Charlotte set down her cup. She was very tired. She was 24 years old and already very tired in a way that wasn't about the walk or the heat, that was about years of invisible labor and invisible loneliness and the particular weight of being in a room with someone who never truly saw you. She was very tired. And underneath the tiredness, small and persistent and refusing to be drowned out by anything else, was something else. Something that felt startlingly like the beginning of her own life. "All right," Charlotte Whitmore said to her aunt to the kitchen to whatever came next. "All right." She folded her hands around the warm cup and sat very still in the summer dark, and the fireflies went on coming up out of the grass outside the window, and the night settled in around her, and she was still there. Still here. 3 days passed before Nathaniel Caldwell noticed the silence. Not the quiet the house had always had its quiet moments. Those stretches between breakfast and the midday meal, when the staff moved through their tasks and the rooms sat in the particular stillness of a well-run home. He'd always taken that quiet for granted, the way a man takes for granted the sound of a clock ticking until the moment it stops. This was different. This was the silence of a house that had lost its organizing principle. He noticed it first at breakfast on the third morning when he sat down and found his coffee already poured, but the cup was wrong. One of the everyday cups, not the good ones, because Charlotte had always been the one who knew which was which and why it mattered, and had apparently conveyed this information to nobody else in the household. He noticed it when he asked Della, the kitchen woman who'd worked for the Caldwells for 11 years, whether there was cream. And Della looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not hostile, not insubordinate, but not quite the expression of a woman who felt entirely certain of her footing and said, "I'll find some, Mr. Caldwell," and went off to find it. Charlotte would have known where the cream was. He pushed the thought aside. He had things to do. There was always work on an estate this size. Fencing to check in the lower pasture accounts to review with his steward. A meeting with a horse trader from Lexington who was coming Thursday. He had built this estate into what it was through attention and discipline, and an absolute refusal to let sentiment interfere with the management of things, and he was not going to let sentiment interfere now. He told himself this with some force. It helped mostly until around mid-morning, when he went to his study to look for the household accounts ledger and found that he didn't know where it was. He stood in the middle of his study and understood for the first time with any real clarity that Charlotte had kept the household accounts. Not his steward, not him. Charlotte, who had taken over the task somewhere in the first year of their marriage because she'd found an error in the steward's figures and corrected it, and then with the quiet efficiency that characterized everything she did, simply continued doing it because she was better at it than anyone else. He called for his steward, a thin, nervous man named Pratt, who had been with the estate for 6 years and managed the field operations well, but had always deferred to Charlotte on the domestic side of the ledger. "Pratt," he said when the man appeared in the doorway, "the household accounts, where are they kept?" Pratt looked at him with the expression of a man who has just been asked to perform a task in a language he doesn't speak. "Mrs. Caldwell kept them, sir, in the sitting room, I believe, the blue secretary desk." Nathaniel went to the sitting room. The blue secretary desk was locked. The key he discovered after 20 minutes of searching was not anywhere he could find. Charlotte had taken it. Not maliciously, he found himself fairly certain of that, because malice had never been Charlotte's way, but simply because it was hers, and she had taken it with her in the same practical spirit with which she'd packed her bag and walked out of his house. He sat down in the sitting room chair and looked at the locked desk and felt something he was not accustomed to feeling. It wasn't precisely regret. It wasn't guilt. It was something colder and more structural. The feeling of a man who has pulled a supporting beam out of a wall and is now listening to the house settle around him, and understanding too late what the beam was for. He sent a message to his solicitor in Harrodsburg. He hired a locksmith to come open the desk. He told himself this was all entirely manageable. By the end of the first week, 4 things had gone wrong that Charlotte would have prevented. The first was the preserves. The kitchen woman Della had put up the summer preserves without realizing they were low on jars, because Charlotte was the one who counted jars each spring and ordered what was needed, and Della had never had to think about it. Half the summer fruit went to waste. The second was old Marcus. Marcus had worked the Caldwell estate for 22 years. He was 63, did lighter work now, mending tack-odd carpentry jobs, feeding the chickens, and he had a knee that swelled up bad in damp weather and required a particular poultice that the Versailles apothecary made up, which Charlotte had always ordered and made sure was on hand. Nobody ordered it. Marcus's knee swelled. He missed 3 days of work and came back still limping, and when Nathaniel passed him in the yard and Marcus touched his hat and didn't quite meet his eyes, Nathaniel had the uncomfortable sensation that he had failed someone in a way he couldn't articulate precisely. The third was a bill from the fabric merchant in Harrodsburg, a quarterly account Charlotte had been settling, which now sat on his desk, unpaid, and 2 weeks overdue, which mattered in a town where reputation was currency. The fourth was the Harrington dinner. Edmund Harrington had invited Nathaniel to dine at the Harrington estate on the Saturday of that week, and Nathaniel had accepted because Edmund Harrington was a man of business and their relationship was useful. What he hadn't calculated, what he should have calculated and hadn't, because Charlotte had always been the one who calculated these things, was that the Harrington dinner would mean sitting across the table from Amelia Harrington for the duration of an entire evening in her family's home, with her father watching and her mother asking pointed questions, and the whole machinery of the occasion arranged around an outcome Nathaniel was now suddenly not at all sure he wanted. Amelia was beautiful, she was charming. She laughed at the right moments and deferred in the right ways and knew exactly how to make a man feel significant without appearing to try. Over dessert, she leaned toward Nathaniel slightly and said in a voice pitched for only him, "I hope things have been not too difficult at home." "Things are fine," he said. "Of course," she said with a smile that suggested she knew they weren't. "I just think about you is all. Alone in that big house." He smiled back. He made the appropriate responses. He rode home in the warm summer dark and arrived at a house that was lit only in the kitchen and the front hall, and he stood in his own entrance hall for a long moment in the silence and thought about what Amelia Harrington had meant by the word alone. She'd meant it as an invitation. He understood that. What he hadn't expected was the feeling that rose in him standing in that silent hall. Not excitement, not the straightforward desire of a man considering a woman who was available and interested, but something that felt much more like the particular blankness of a place where something used to be. He went to bed. He didn't sleep well. The letter from Thomas Aldridge's wife arrived on a Tuesday. It had been posted from Boston 11 days earlier. A prompt response, the kind a woman sends when she understands the urgency of a situation, even if the letter requesting it has been carefully neutral in tone. Charlotte had written to her before she'd even left the house. Nathaniel turned this over in his mind as he stood in his study, holding the letter which Pratt had brought in with the morning correspondence, and which bore a Boston postmark and an address he didn't recognize. He opened it. The letter was 3 paragraphs. It was written in a clear, educated hand. It stated that Thomas Aldridge had indeed passed through Kentucky in late June, on his way to Missouri Territory, that he had mentioned in a subsequent letter to his wife that he had encountered his cousin Charlotte, by happy accident, in Harrodsburg, and had a brief visit with her on the street, and that Mrs. Aldridge would be happy to provide further attestation if required, and enclosed her address. Nathaniel read it twice. He set it on his desk. He sat down. He sat there for a long time, long enough that Pratt appeared in the doorway to ask if he'd be wanting his midday meal, and Nathaniel said yes, without looking up from the middle distance he'd been staring at. A cousin. Thomas Aldridge was her cousin. She had told him that. She had told him that the same night, standing in his front parlor with the dinner guests, barely out the door, and he had heard the words and he had not believed them. Not because the words were unbelievable, but because he had already been building something in his mind, some story in which what Amelia Harrington had said was true, and Charlotte's explanation was the lie, and he'd needed it to be that way for reasons he was not entirely prepared even now to examine. He picked up the letter again. He thought about Charlotte standing in the herb garden with stems in her hands saying, "The truth would not have changed it." She'd been right. He hadn't been looking for the truth. He'd been looking for permission. Permission to be done with a marriage that had never been what he'd wanted it to be. Not because Charlotte had failed it, but because he'd never quite allowed it to be anything. Because he'd married her for the practical reasons men of his standing married, and had expected the marriage to proceed along practical lines, and had never once turned to her and said, "This is not enough for me, Charlotte, and I'm not sure I know how to do better, and I'm afraid that's my failure, not yours." He'd never said any of that. Instead, he'd let Amelia Harrington's rumor give him what he'd been too much of a coward to take honestly, a way out that let him feel like the wronged party. Nathaniel Caldwell sat at his desk with the letter from Boston in his hand, and understood perhaps for the first time in his adult life that he was not a good man. He had the reputation of one. He had the house and the land and the standing of one. But a good man would have waited for the truth. A good man would have trusted his wife of 3 years over a woman with an obvious interest in destroying her. He hadn't done that. He'd done the easier thing. He'd believed what he'd wanted to believe. He folded the letter and put it in the drawer. 3 weeks after Charlotte left, Nathaniel rode to Versailles. He told himself saddling his own horse that morning, because his groom was out sick, and he'd discovered he didn't know where the stable boy kept the extra saddle pads that he was going because he owed Charlotte an explanation. An apology. Some acknowledgement of the truth that had arrived in a letter from Boston. He told himself this all the way down the post road past the fields and the crossroads and the stretch of oak trees that lined the approach to Versailles. He found Ruth Whitmore's house without difficulty. It was the kind of town where a single inquiry was sufficient, and he knocked at the white door and waited. Ruth Whitmore opened it. She was a small woman, compact with the kind of face that had settled into its expressions over decades and showed absolutely everything it intended to show, and nothing it didn't. She looked at Nathaniel Caldwell on her doorstep for a long, unhurried moment. "Mr. Caldwell," she said. "Ma'am," he said. He removed his hat. "I'd like to speak with Charlotte if she's willing." That, Ruth said, will depend entirely on Charlotte. She left him on the step, not unkindly, but without any invitation to come in, and closed the door. He stood there in the summer heat with his hat in his hands and heard faintly voices inside. Low voices. He couldn't make out words. The door opened again. "She'll see you," Ruth said. "In the garden, not inside." He followed her around the side of the house to a small kitchen garden, not unlike the one at the Caldwell estate he registered with the same kind of care evident in the arrangement of it. Charlotte was standing near the far wall with her arms at her sides and her chin level, and an expression that told him she had spent some time preparing herself for this. She looked different. He couldn't place exactly how at first. She was wearing a plain everyday dress he didn't think he'd seen before, her hair pinned simply, no jewelry. She looked lighter. That was the word that came to him, and it confused him because she'd lost something in these 3 weeks. She'd lost the position, and the house, and the life she'd been building, and yet she looked lighter than he'd seen her in a long time. He stopped a few feet from her. "Charlotte," he said. "Nathaniel," she said, not coldly, simply. "I received a letter," he said, "from Mrs. Aldridge, in Boston." Something crossed her face, not triumph, nothing like it. Tiredness, maybe. "I see," she said. "Thomas Aldridge is your cousin," he said. "Yes." "You told me that." "I did." He turned his hat in his hands. "I owe you an apology. What I did, how I handled this, it was wrong. I should have believed you. I should have waited for the truth before I—" He stopped. "I'm sorry, Charlotte. I am genuinely sorry." She looked at him. She didn't move. "I believe you," she said quietly. "I believe that you mean that." He exhaled. He'd expected, he wasn't sure what he'd expected. Perhaps something a little more like relief. "Then," he began. "But an apology," Charlotte said, "is not the same as an explanation. And I think before either of us says anything else, I need to understand something." She paused. "The letters were coming. You knew they were coming. You knew I'd written to my father and to Thomas's wife. And you came to me in the garden anyway without waiting for them, and you ended our marriage." He said nothing, which tells me, Charlotte said with the same steady, careful voice she'd used in his garden 3 weeks ago, that the letters wouldn't have mattered, that you had already decided. And what I need to understand, Nathaniel, what I deserve to understand, is what you actually decided. Because it wasn't just that you believed I'd been unfaithful. It was something else. The garden was very quiet. A bee moved through the lavender beside the wall. Somewhere in the house, a door opened and closed. Nathaniel looked at his wife, his former wife, and understood that she was right, and that she had always been right, and that the particular discomfort he was feeling was not guilt about a mistake. It was the discomfort of a man being seen clearly by the only person who had ever looked at him that way. "I didn't know how to be married to you," he said. It came out before he'd decided to say it. He heard it in the air between them and couldn't take it back. I had thought marriage would be one thing, and it was another, and I didn't know how to, I couldn't." He stopped, pressed his jaw together. "That is not an excuse. I know it isn't. But you asked what I decided, and that's the truth of it. I decided it was easier to end it than to learn how to be in it." Charlotte looked at him for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was very quiet. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me that honestly." "Charlotte, I forgive you," she said. "I want you to know that. Not because you've earned it, not yet, but because carrying that kind of anger is something I've decided I won't do. I forgive you, Nathaniel." He felt something loosen in his chest, just a little, just enough to breathe. "Then come home," he said. "We can begin again. I'll do better. No," Charlotte said. The word was quiet and absolute. "What?" "I'm not coming back," she said. "Not yet, not now." She held his gaze. "Forgiving you isn't the same as pretending the last 3 years were something other than what they were. I spent 3 years being invisible in that house. I spent 3 years doing work that nobody saw and being looked through by the one person I'd hoped would actually see me. And I left, and in 3 weeks, I have." She paused, and something moved through her expression that he recognized with a jolt as the very early beginning of something that looked like happiness. "I've done things, I've made decisions, I've had conversations with my aunt that have made me understand things about myself I did not know before, and I am not." Her voice was firm, unapologetic. "I am not the woman who left your house 3 weeks ago, Nathaniel. That woman needed you to choose her. This woman is choosing herself." He stared at her. "You're serious," he said. "Entirely. Charlotte, I'm asking you to come home. I'm admitting I was wrong. What more?" "Do you know?" she said, cutting him off with a gentleness that was more devastating than anger would have been. "What I had for breakfast this morning?" He blinked. What?" "I had coffee," she said, "with cream. And I sat at my aunt's kitchen table, and I read. I just read. For half an hour with no list of tasks waiting, no accounts to reconcile, no staff to organize. I sat and I read a book I chose because I wanted to read it, and I drank my coffee. And when I was done, I went out to help my aunt in her garden, because I wanted to, not because it was required of me." She paused. "I have not had a morning like that in 3 years. I had forgotten they were possible." Nathaniel stood in the summer garden with his hat in his hands, and felt something shift in his understanding of the last 3 years. Not all at once, not cleanly, but like a large piece of furniture being moved an inch or two in a dark room, just enough to change the shape of the space. "I'm not saying never," Charlotte said quietly. "I'm saying not like this. Not because you've arrived with an apology and an expectation. If there is ever going to be anything between us again, it will be because we have both become people who are capable of it. And right now, Nathaniel," she met his eyes, "right now, I don't think you know who you are without the house and the estate and the title, and I don't think you can love anyone honestly until you do." He didn't answer immediately. He wanted to argue. He could feel the shape of arguments in his mouth about practicality, about what people would say about the legal and social complexities of their situation. All the things he'd always reached for when emotion made him uncomfortable. He didn't say any of them. "All right," he said instead, quietly. "All right, Charlotte." She nodded, once. "Thank you for coming," she said, "and thank you for the apology. It mattered." He put his hat back on. He turned to go. At the edge of the garden he stopped. "The household accounts," he said, not quite looking at her. "Pratt can't find the ledger system you'd organized. It's been somewhat disorganized." There was a pause. Then unexpectedly Charlotte laughed. It was a short laugh, not unkind, but genuinely amused, and it was the most natural sound he'd heard from her in longer than he could remember. "The ledger is in this blue secretary desk," she said. "The key is on my aunt's keyring. I'll have a copy made and sent to Pratt. The system is straightforward. He just needs to start from the June entries and work forward." "Thank you," he said. "Goodbye, Nathaniel," she said. He rode home to an empty house. He thought about what she'd said for days. "I don't think you know who you are without the house and the estate and the title." He thought about it at breakfast in the wrong cup. He thought about it when he checked on old Marcus and found the man's knee still wrapped and asked for the first time how he was managing, and saw the surprise on Marcus's face, the genuine, unguarded surprise of a man who hadn't expected to be asked. He thought about it when he rode his own perimeter on a Thursday morning and realized he hadn't done this, just ridden his own land without agenda, without it being a task on a list in years. He'd always had Charlotte managing the house, and Pratt managing the fields, and himself managing the larger decisions, and somewhere in that arrangement, he'd stopped touching the actual texture of the place he lived. He thought about what that said about him. He rode to Amelia Harrington's estate on a Friday afternoon, not because he wanted to, but because he owed her something that had nothing to do with what she wanted from him. He was shown into the parlor and waited, and when Amelia came in with that particular composed smile, he stood and said without preamble, without letting her get comfortable in the conversation, "First, I know what you did." She didn't quite manage to keep the composure in place. It wobbled just for a second. "I beg your pardon?" she said. "The rumor," he said. "At my dinner. I know it was deliberate, Amelia. I know Thomas Aldridge is Charlotte's cousin and you knew it and you spread that story anyway." "Nathaniel, I simply repeated what I—" "Don't," he said, not loudly, quietly, the way he said things when he was completely certain. "Please don't. We've known each other long enough that I'd like you to not insult my intelligence." She was very still. "You wanted me to end my marriage," he said, "and I gave you what you wanted, and that is my failing, not yours. I want to be clear that I am not here to blame you for what I chose to do, but I am here to tell you that I know, and that there will be no—" He paused, choosing the word. "There will be nothing between us, Amelia. There is nothing between us. Whatever you hoped might follow from this, it won't." Amelia Harrington looked at him with those dark, knowing eyes, and for a moment, the composure dropped entirely, and he saw something underneath it, not quite hurt, not quite anger, something more like the expression of a person who has played a long game very carefully and lost. "She's not coming back, you know," Amelia said. Her voice was different now, stripped of its social instrument quality. "You ended it publicly. Whatever she says about forgiving you, Charlotte Whitmore is not the kind of woman who walks back into a house where she was humiliated. You've lost her." "I know that," Nathaniel said. He meant it differently than she did. He meant it as something he was only beginning to understand the full weight of. He left the Harrington estate and rode home, and this time when he arrived at the empty house, he stood in his front hallway and didn't try to push away what he felt. He stood in it. He let it settle on him, all of it, the silence and the wrong coffee cup and the locked desk, and Marcus's surprised face and Charlotte laughing in the garden because she'd finally had a morning that belonged to her. He'd done this, not Amelia Harrington, not the rumor, not bad luck or bad timing, him. He'd had a woman in this house who'd kept every living thing inside it breathing and warm, and he'd looked through her for 3 years, and then used the first available excuse to be rid of her. and now he was standing in the silence she'd left, and it was nothing like the relief he'd expected. He went upstairs. He went to the room that had been hers, that had been theirs, then only hers, and he opened the door and stood in the doorway. Her things were gone. Of course they were. But the room still had the faint smell of the lavender she'd kept in the window, and the dressing table still had the jewelry laid out in a neat line. The pearl earbobs and the garnet brooch and the thin gold bracelet, all the things he'd given her that she'd left behind. He crossed to the dressing table. He picked up the bracelet. He turned it in his hand. He'd given her this on their first anniversary. He'd handed it to her at breakfast across the table without ceremony, the way he did most things. She'd said thank you, and put it on, and worn it that day and the next, and he'd seen her handle it carefully the way she handled things she treasured, and he hadn't thought much about it then. She'd left it. Not from spite. He understood that. She'd left it because she was leaving Charlotte Caldwell behind and all that belonged to her, and she was walking out into whatever came next as Charlotte Whitmore, and she didn't need his bracelet for that. He set it down. He sat on the edge of the bed in the empty room and put his head in his hands and stayed there for a long time. He wasn't going to cry. He wasn't entirely sure he knew how or whether he'd ever learned. But something was happening in his chest, something shifting and resettling. And when it was done, he was left with a feeling he could only describe as the very first, very unwelcome, very necessary feeling of a man beginning to know himself. He didn't like what he was beginning to see, but he didn't look away. So, word got around the way it did in small Kentucky towns that the Caldwells had separated. People talked about it at church and over back fences and at the general store in the careful way that people discuss the private disasters of people they know socially. He heard the edges of it on his Thursday trip to Harrodsburg, a conversation that stopped when he entered the Merchants, a pair of women who looked at him with an expression he hadn't seen directed at himself before, something between pity and judgment, leaning toward the latter. He heard through Pratt, who heard through Della, who heard through the web of domestic information that ran through every household in the county, that Charlotte was well, that she was staying with her aunt, that she had apparently begun teaching reading twice a week to the women at the church in Versailles, something she'd wanted to do for years and never had time for, that she'd been seen at a quilting society meeting looking by all accounts remarkably well. That last piece of information arrived on a Wednesday morning, and Nathaniel sat with it over his coffee in the right cup now, because he'd asked Della to show him which was which, and she had, with the same surprised expression Marcus had worn when he'd been asked how his knee was doing, and felt something that was not quite the pure pain of loss. It was something more complicated, something that contained underneath the ache of it a reluctant, genuine pride. She was all right. She was more than all right. Charlotte Whitmore had walked out of his house with a bag and her mother's Bible and 3 years of invisible strength she'd been accumulating without knowing it. And she was teaching women to read in Versailles and going to quilting meetings and drinking her coffee in the mornings with a book. And she was all right. He had not made her. He had not, it turned out, been necessary to her. He'd thought he was. He'd thought somewhere underneath all the practical reasoning he'd used to arrange their marriage and then to end it that he was the condition of her existence in some fundamental way, that she needed the estate, the title, the position he provided. He'd thought that was why women married. He'd thought that was what he offered. But Charlotte Whitmore had walked out his door with nothing and was building something anyway. He understood now what she'd been telling him in her aunt's garden. He didn't know who he was without the house and the land and the title, and he couldn't love anyone honestly until he did. He'd spent his life being Nathaniel Caldwell of Caldwell Estate. He'd inherited the name and the land and the standing, and he'd managed them well, and he'd built his entire sense of himself around the managing of them. Strip it away, and what was there? He sat at his breakfast table in the summer heat in the quiet house with the right coffee cup and the wrong life, and he tried to answer that question. He didn't have an answer yet, but for the first time in as long as he could remember, Nathaniel Caldwell was asking. The question didn't leave him. That was the thing about questions you'd spent your whole life avoiding once you finally let them in. They didn't have the decency to stay quiet. They moved through a man the way water moves through cracked ground, finding every hollow every place where the foundation wasn't quite as solid as it looked from the outside. Nathaniel had built his life on the assumption that he knew himself. He knew his land. He knew his horses. He knew how to read a contract and manage a negotiation and present himself in any room he entered with the kind of authority that made other men defer to him. He'd always taken that self-knowledge for granted, the way he'd taken the coffee cup for granted, the way he'd taken Charlotte for granted, assuming that because something had always been there, it would simply go on being there, requiring nothing from him in return. He was beginning to understand how much that assumption had cost him. It was Pratt who brought him the first real shock on a Monday morning in the 4th week after Charlotte had left. Pratt appeared in the study doorway with his hat in his hands, and a look on his face that Nathaniel had learned to associate with news he wasn't going to enjoy, and said, "The Hendersons have given notice, sir." Nathaniel looked up from the ledger, the one Charlotte had sent the key for, the one whose system Pratt had mostly figured out, and said, "Which Hendersons?" "Both of them, sir. Tom and Mary. Tom says they've had an offer from the Wickham farm and they're taking it. Mary says—" Pratt stopped. His jaw worked. "Mary says she can't work in a house that treated Mrs. Caldwell the way it did. Those were her words, sir. I thought you should hear them as they were said." The silence in the study was complete. "She said that," Nathaniel said. "Yes, sir." He let it sit. He turned the pen over in his hand. Mary Henderson had been the upstairs maid at Caldwell House for 4 years. She'd worked for 2 other families before that, and Charlotte had hired her and trained her and apparently earned from her a loyalty fierce enough to walk away from a steady position over. "Thank her for her service," he said. "Pay them both through the month." Pratt nodded, turned to go. "Pratt," Nathaniel said. The man stopped. "What do the rest of them think? The staff?" Pratt was quiet for a moment in the way of a man deciding how honest to be. Then he said carefully, "They respected Mrs. Caldwell, sir. A great deal. She—" He stopped again. "She remembered things about people. Small things. Who had a sick child who needed an afternoon on a particular day? People don't forget that kind of remembering." Nathaniel nodded. Pratt left. Nathaniel sat with the pen in his hand and thought about Mary Henderson, who had 4 years of work invested in this house, who had chosen to leave it because of what he'd done to Charlotte. He thought about what that meant. Not about Mary Henderson in particular, but about the kind of person Charlotte had been in this house. The kind of person who built loyalties he hadn't known existed, who created bonds he'd been entirely blind to, who had woven herself into the life of this estate in ways that were only becoming visible now that she was gone. He hadn't known. He hadn't known because he hadn't looked. On the Thursday of that same week, he rode into Harrodsburg for a meeting with a cotton buyer from Louisville and stopped at the tavern afterward for a meal, because the kitchen at Caldwell House had been producing uninspired results since Mary Henderson left, and took with her whatever knowledge she'd had of what Nathaniel actually liked to eat. He was finishing his meal when Judge Danvers came in. The judge was a large man, affable in the way of men who've spent decades being respected in their community and have settled comfortably into the expectation of it. He'd been at the Caldwell dinner party. He'd been in the room when Nathaniel stopped himself. When Nathaniel had said what he'd said to Charlotte. He'd known it would be a problem running into people who'd been there. He hadn't quite calculated how much of a problem. The judge saw him, paused, and then came over, not with the warmth of a man running toward a social equal, but with the deliberateness of a man who's decided to say something and is going to say it whether it's comfortable or not. "Caldwell," he said. "Judge Danvers." Nathaniel half rose, the social reflex. "Sit down." Danvers pulled out the chair across from him without being invited and sat. He signaled for a drink. Then he looked at Nathaniel with the eyes of a man who'd been on the bench for 20 years and had very little patience left for people who tried to be something other than what they were. "I'm going to say something you're not going to enjoy hearing," he said. "Judge, I was at your house that night," Danvers said. "I was in that room. I watched you say what you said to that young woman in front of 30 people over a piece of gossip from Amelia Harrington." He paused to let that sit. Now I've known your family for a long time, Nathaniel. I respected your father, and I am telling you man to man that what you did that evening was one of the most dishonorable things I have witnessed in 25 years of sitting on a bench in this county." The tavern went on around them. Nobody was listening, or everybody was listening quietly the way people do in small towns. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "I received information that led me to believe you received a rumor," Danvers said flatly, "from a woman who wanted your wife gone. And you acted on it without verification in public at your own dinner table with your wife standing there in her own house." He shook his head. "Your father would have been ashamed of you, son." It landed like a physical thing. Nathaniel had prepared himself in the weeks since Charlotte had left for various versions of social difficulty. Avoidance whispers the closed doors that come when a community has quietly decided where its sympathies lie. He hadn't prepared for someone to sit down across from him and say what he'd been saying to himself in the dark, and say it worse. "I know," Nathaniel said. Danvers looked at him. "Do you?" "Yes." He met the judge's eyes. "I know exactly what I did, Judge. I've known it since before the dust settled, and knowing it hasn't made it easier to undo." Danvers was quiet for a moment. His drink arrived. He wrapped a hand around it. "Charlotte Whitmore," he said, "was one of the finest women I've had the pleasure of knowing socially. My wife said so too, and Eleanor is not generous with that opinion. She ran your house like it was a person she loved. She knew the name of every man working your fields. She sent preserves to half the widows in the county." He paused. "You've lost something, Caldwell. I don't think you quite understand yet how much." "I'm beginning to," Nathaniel said. "Beginning isn't enough." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." Danvers studied him for another long moment. Then, with the air of a man who has said what he came to say and is now willing to let the verdict rest with the defendant, he picked up his drink and changed the subject to business. But Nathaniel carried the judge's words home with him, sat with them at the empty dinner table, turned them over and over, the way you turn over something with a sharp edge, carefully trying to find the part that doesn't cut. There wasn't a part that didn't cut. Your father would have been ashamed of you. He thought about his father. A man who'd worked this land himself, who'd known every worker by name, not because it was good management, but because they were people, and that seemed to him the obvious way to treat people. A man who'd spoken of Nathaniel's mother with a warmth that Nathaniel had always found vaguely embarrassing, and was now beginning to understand as the thing he'd failed to inherit. His father had seen his mother, genuinely, completely seen her in the way Nathaniel had never managed to see Charlotte. He poured himself a drink he didn't particularly want, and sat in the too quiet front parlor and thought about the kind of man his father had been, and the kind of man he was, and the distance between them. Ted. The letter from Charlotte's father arrived on a Saturday. William Whitmore was 64 years old, a retired attorney who lived in Richmond with Charlotte's mother, and he wrote in the precise, measured style of a man who had spent 40 years choosing words for legal documents and had not entirely left the habit behind. The letter was 3 pages. It was not angry. It was something considerably worse than angry. It was disappointed. It laid out in clear and patient language the facts of Charlotte's situation, as William Whitmore understood them from his daughter's letters. The dinner party, the rumor the 2 weeks of Nathaniel's silence, the garden, the ring left by the door. It noted without dramatic inflection that Charlotte had not been provided the basic dignity of being believed by the man who had promised before God to stand by her. It noted that whatever legal arrangements Nathaniel's solicitor intended to make Charlotte's family would be engaged in reviewing them on her behalf. It noted in its final paragraph something that Nathaniel read 3 times. It said, "Charlotte has asked me not to be angry on her behalf, and I am honoring that request, because she has earned the right to choose how her own story is handled. But I want you to know, Nathaniel, that I gave you my daughter's hand in the genuine belief that you were a man of character. I'm not certain from the evidence before me that I was right. I hope the coming months will prove me wrong." Nathaniel set the letter on his desk. He thought about the moment he hadn't let himself think about this directly, had skirted around it every time it came near the moment in the front parlor, the night of the dinner party. When he'd looked at Charlotte's face and she'd been telling him the truth, and he'd known it somewhere, underneath all the noise of Amelia's story and his own cowardice, he had known it, and he'd chosen not to believe it anyway. That was the thing he'd been avoiding, not the mistake. Mistakes were manageable. You could apologize for a mistake, correct it, move on. What he'd done was different. He had known, or close enough to known, and he had chosen the lie because the lie was convenient. Because it gave him the exit he hadn't had the courage to take honestly. He was not a man who thought well of himself in that moment. He sat for a long time. Then he opened his desk drawer and took out a sheet of paper and began to write back to William Whitmore. He wrote for an hour. He didn't defend himself. He didn't explain or qualify or reach for the kind of reasoning that makes a man feel better about the things he's done. He wrote the truth simply the way Charlotte had always spoken to him, even when he hadn't deserved it. He wrote, "You were right to give me your daughter, Mr. Whitmore. The error was mine in not becoming the man who deserved her. I intend to work on that, whatever it requires, and however long it takes, not because I expect anything in return, but because it's the right thing to do. Charlotte told me when I came to Versailles to apologize that I don't know who I am without my house and my land. She was correct. I'm learning who I am. I'm not proud of what I'm finding, but I am not looking away from it." He sealed the letter. He sent it. He felt for the first time in weeks like he'd done something honest. It was Della who told him about the quilting circle, not deliberately. Della wasn't the kind of woman to gossip with her employer. She was professional, quiet, efficient in the way she'd always been, though, with a warmth toward him that had been noticeably absent in the first 2 weeks after Charlotte left, and had returned gradually as she'd apparently decided he was engaging in some form of genuine reckoning. She mentioned it in passing while he was going over the week's kitchen accounts that she'd heard from her sister-in-law who lived in Versailles, that Mrs. Whitmore she'd gone back to calling Charlotte. Mrs. Whitmore, which landed every time like a small precise correction that Mrs. Whitmore had started a reading class at the church. "A reading class," he said. "Yes, sir, for the women who never had the chance to learn proper. She goes on Tuesday mornings. My sister-in-law's neighbor attends." A pause. "She says Mrs. Whitmore is a fine teacher, patient, explains things so they make sense." He nodded. He went back to the accounts. He thought about Charlotte, who had read voraciously all through their marriage books from the Harrodsburg Lending Library, whatever she could get her hands on, but had never not once mentioned that she wanted to teach. He wondered now if she'd wanted to all along and had simply never had time, had simply never been in a position where her own wants could take up space. He thought about all the space he'd occupied in that marriage, all the space that had been implicitly his needs, his schedule, his social obligations, his discomfort, his pride, his exit. He'd filled the whole house with himself without ever noticing there was someone else inside it. It was he was coming to understand a particular kind of blindness, the kind that looks like confidence from the outside, and only reveals itself as selfishness when the person you've been blind to finally leaves. The second large shock came on a Wednesday in early August. He'd ridden to the east pasture to check on a fence line that Pratt had flagged as needing repair, and on his way back, he'd stopped to speak with James Okafor, one of his senior field workers. A man in his late 30s who'd worked Caldwell land for 7 years and ran his crew with an efficiency Nathaniel had always relied on without examining too closely. James was mending a gate post. He looked up when Nathaniel approached, offered the standard courtesy, and went back to his work. Nathaniel dismounted. He didn't know exactly why. He stood beside the fence and said without any real plan, "How are things out here?" James looked at him sideways. "Work's getting done, Mr. Caldwell." "I know it is. I meant—" He stopped. He tried something he wasn't practiced at. "How are you getting on, generally?" James put down his tool. He looked at Nathaniel with the careful expression of a man assessing whether a question is genuine or performative. He apparently decided it was at least partially genuine. "It's different," James said, "since Mrs. Caldwell left." "Different how?" "She used to come out here," James said. Not often, but sometimes when there was something needed knowing. She'd come out and she'd talk to people, ask questions. He paused. When my boy was sick last winter, she sent the doctor out here herself. Didn't say anything about it to anyone, just sent him. He looked at Nathaniel steadily. I didn't know until later that it was her who did it. Nathaniel said nothing. She paid for it herself, James said, out of her household allowance. My boy was very sick, Mr. Caldwell. He's fine now, but last winter he was very sick and she sent a doctor. The post road was quiet behind them. A hawk was circling somewhere high above the east pasture. I didn't know that, Nathaniel said. No, sir. James picked up his tool. I don't suppose you did. Nathaniel rode home with that in his chest. James Okafor's quiet statement, without accusation, without drama. The simple fact of what Charlotte had done and what Nathaniel had not known. He tallied it against Mary Henderson, who had quit her position over what had been done to Charlotte. Against Judge Danvers, who had sat across from him in a tavern and told him his father would have been ashamed. Against William Whitmore's letter, 3 careful pages of disappointed precision. Against Marcus's swollen knee, which Charlotte had remembered without being asked, and Nathaniel hadn't known about until the man missed 3 days of work. He was beginning to see the full shape of what he'd been blind to. Not just Charlotte. Not just his marriage. His entire life on this land, the people who worked it, who moved through it daily, who had built their own relationships and loyalties and small significant histories with the woman he'd dismissed. He'd been the owner of this estate for 10 years, and he'd managed it with efficiency, and he had never not once sent a doctor to a sick child out of his own pocket without being asked. Charlotte had. Charlotte had quietly, repeatedly in the gaps between everything else she was doing, been the human heart of a place he'd run like a machine. He went to his father's study. He'd always called it his father's study. In his mind, even after a decade, and sat at the desk and looked at the room. Really looked at it. The portrait of his father on the wall done 20 years ago, before Nathaniel had been old enough to fully understand what he was looking at. His father's face in it, which he hadn't let himself look at directly in years, because there was something in it that made him feel a particular way he'd never named clearly. He named it now. Insufficient. He'd always felt looking at his father's portrait that he was insufficient, that his father had been something he'd failed to become. He'd responded to that feeling the way he responded to most uncomfortable things, by building the outer shape of the life his father had had, and filling it in with efficiency and accomplishment, and refusing to examine whether the inside matched the outside. Charlotte had known. He understood that now. She'd known somewhere, even if she couldn't have articulated it in those exact terms, that she was living with a man who was performing a life rather than inhabiting one, who was too afraid of his own insufficiency to allow anyone close enough to see it. That was why he'd believed Amelia Harrington. Not really because of the rumor, not because Amelia was persuasive or the story was plausible, but because intimacy, real intimacy, the kind Charlotte had been offering him for 3 years, in every careful act and quiet competence, had terrified him. And Amelia's rumor had given him a way to run from it that looked like something other than running. He sat in his father's study for a long time. When he got up, he went to find old Marcus. He found him in the tack room, working on a piece of harness, with hands that moved slowly because of the knee, which was better, but not entirely right. Nathaniel stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he said, "Marcus, how long has that knee been giving you trouble?" Marcus looked up. "On and off, Mr. Caldwell. Years." Did Mrs. Caldwell know about it?" A slow nod. "Yes, sir. She kept the poultice in the storeroom for me, ordered it herself from the apothecary in Versailles. Said it wasn't right for a man to work in pain when there was something easy enough to do about it." "We ran out of it," Nathaniel said, "after she left." "Yes, sir, we did. I'll order more," Nathaniel said. "From now on, I'll keep it in the storeroom. If there's anything else you need to work comfortably, you tell Pratt and he'll see to it, or you can tell me directly." Marcus looked at him for a long moment with eyes that had seen a great deal over 63 years. "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell," he said. It was a small thing. It was an embarrassingly small thing. A poultice for an old man's knee. a piece of basic human attention that Charlotte had been providing without fanfare for years. But Nathaniel felt the weight of it as he walked back to the house, felt the contrast between the man who hadn't known and the man he was trying to become, and understood that becoming was not a statement. It was a long series of small things done quietly, without expecting anything in return, the way Charlotte had always done them. The third shock arrived at the end of August, and it was the one that broke something open in him that had been sealed for a very long time. He received a visit from Reverend Cartwright, the minister from the Versailles Church, who came not as a social call, but as a matter of specific business. Reverend Cartwright was a lean, serious man in his 50s who wasted very little time on anything, and he sat in Nathaniel's front parlor and said after the minimum of preamble, "I'm here because of Charlotte." Nathaniel sat up straighter. "Is she all right?" "She's more than all right," Cartwright said. "That's not why I'm here." He paused, studying Nathaniel with the particular gaze of a man who has spent decades reading people in their most honest moments. "She's been teaching at our church for 6 weeks now. I've watched her work. She has—" He stopped, searched for the word. "She has a gift for seeing people, for understanding what they need and meeting them there. I've rarely seen it in someone her age." Nathaniel said nothing. "2 of her students," Cartwright continued, "couldn't read a word when she started. One of them wrote her own name for the first time last week. She's 53 years old, Mr. Caldwell. She wept, and Charlotte wept with her." He folded his hands. "I came here because I thought you should know what kind of woman you turned away." The front parlor was very quiet. "I know," Nathaniel said. His voice was rougher than he intended. "I know what kind of woman she is." "Do you?" Cartwright said. Not unkindly, but with the weight of a man who has genuine doubts. "I'm beginning to," Nathaniel said. Something in the Reverend's expression shifted. "She doesn't speak ill of you," he said. "Not to anyone as far as I know. She doesn't speak of you at all. She's building her life around what she has now, not around what she lost." He paused. "I think that's the measure of her. I thought you might want to know it." After Cartwright left, Nathaniel stood in his front parlor for a long time. He thought about a woman of 53 writing her own name for the first time, and Charlotte weeping with her. He thought about Charlotte at his dinner table for 3 years, quiet and competent and invisible, absorbing everything and giving everything and asking for so little in return. He thought about what she'd said in her aunt's garden. "I am not the woman who left your house 3 weeks ago." She wasn't. She was becoming something he hadn't known was in her, or rather something that had been in her all along. Something she'd had to leave his house to fully become, because in his house there had been no room for it. He had made no room for it. He walked upstairs. He went back to the dressing table where her jewelry still lay. He picked up the bracelet again, the thin gold one from their first anniversary, and held it. Then he opened the small drawer beneath the dressing table, and he put the bracelet inside carefully and closed the drawer. He didn't know what he was saving it for. He only knew that it felt wrong to leave it out there in the open, that it felt like something he should take care of, the way she'd taken care of so many things he'd never even noticed. He went downstairs. He had letters to write. He had an apology to make that was larger than the one he'd made in her aunt's garden, not to Charlotte, not yet, because she'd told him what she needed, and it wasn't more apologies, but to himself. Some reckoning he'd been putting off for 32 years that he was finally at enormous cost beginning to face. He sat at his father's desk. He put pen to paper. He started for the first time in his life to write honestly about himself, not to anyone in particular, just to the page, just the unvarnished account of a man looking at what he'd done and what he'd been, and deciding with whatever was left of his character that it was not going to be the final verdict. He wrote for 2 hours. When he was done, he didn't feel better. He felt emptied out and raw and more honest than he'd been in years, and somewhere underneath the rawness, there was something small and stubborn that felt against all reasonable expectation, like the first solid ground he'd stood on in a very long time. He sealed the pages. Not to send, just to keep. He blew out the lamp. He sat in the dark of his father's study in the house his father had built, and he made himself a promise. Not to Charlotte, not to the ghost of his father's approval. To himself. He was going to become a man worth knowing. However long it took. Whatever it required, he was going to become that man. September came in hot and stayed that way, the kind of heat that makes the whole world feel like it's holding its breath, waiting for something to break. Nathaniel felt it every morning when he woke up in a house that was running better. Now, not well. Not the way it had run when Charlotte was in it, but better than the first terrible weeks, and lay there for a moment before the day started, and took stock of himself the way a man takes stock of a damaged piece of land. What had recovered? What hadn't? What was going to need more time than he'd originally estimated? He'd been doing the small things. He knew that's what they were, small, and he did them anyway because Charlotte had taught him, without ever intending to teach him anything, that the small things were where character actually lived. He'd ordered Marcus's poultice and made sure Pratt knew to keep it stocked. He'd started asking James Okafor directly how the crew was managing, not as a management tactic, but because James Okafor was a man who deserved to be asked. He'd learned which coffee cup was which, and why it mattered to Della that the difference was respected. He'd started walking his own land in the mornings, not to inspect it, but just to be in it, to know it the way his father had known it, not as an asset, but as a place he was responsible to. None of it touched what he'd done to Charlotte. He knew that. He wasn't doing these things to earn his way back to her. He was doing them because he'd spent 32 years being a particular kind of man, and that man had caused serious harm to someone who hadn't deserved it, and he was not willing to remain that man. Whether Charlotte ever knew the difference was separate from whether the difference needed to be made. That distinction, small as it sounded, was the most important thing he'd worked out in 2 months of sitting with himself in the dark. It was Pratt who told him on a Tuesday morning in the second week of September that there was talk in town about Charlotte. Pratt didn't usually bring him social information. It wasn't in his nature, and Nathaniel had never invited it. So the fact of him standing in the study doorway with an uncomfortable look and a piece of news meant it was something he'd decided Nathaniel needed to know. "What kind of talk?" Nathaniel said. "About her situation, sir." Pratt turned his hat in his hands. "About what she's owed, legally. People are saying the settlement offer your solicitor sent was—" He stopped. "People are saying it wasn't fair." Nathaniel went still. "What did my solicitor send?" "I don't know the particulars, sir. I only know what I heard at the mill." Nathaniel sent for his solicitor that afternoon. The man arrived the next morning, a thin, self-important man named Garrett, whose father had handled the Caldwell estate before him, and who operated on the assumption that what was good for the Caldwell family assets was by definition the right outcome. He sat in the study with his papers and his practiced expression of professional neutrality, and explained when Nathaniel asked him directly what had been offered to Charlotte, that the settlement proposal had been structured to protect the estate's liquidity, while still providing, in his words, a reasonable provision for Mrs. Caldwell's basic needs. "Define reasonable," Nathaniel said. Garrett defined it. It was a number that bore no relationship whatsoever to 3 years of Charlotte's labor, her management of his household, her care of his workers, her invisible maintenance of every system that kept Caldwell House functioning. It was the kind of number that said, you were a wife, not a partner, and here is what a wife is worth when a man of property is done with her. The silence in the study after Garrett finished was so complete that Nathaniel could hear the clock on the mantel. "That offer," Nathaniel said slowly, "is inadequate." Garrett blinked. "Sir, the estate's position is fine," Nathaniel said. "The estate's position is excellent. You know that, and I know that." He looked at the man directly. "Charlotte Whitmore managed this household for 3 years. She kept accounts that your predecessor's son couldn't locate. She maintained relationships with workers that are still paying dividends in loyalty and productivity. She spent her own household allowance on a doctor for a field worker's sick child." He paused. "What we offered her is an insult. I want a new proposal on my desk by Friday. A real one." Garrett opened his mouth. "A real one," Nathaniel repeated. Garrett closed his mouth. He gathered his papers. He left. Nathaniel sat at his desk and felt the hot, specific shame of a man who has discovered he was in the process of committing a second wrong on top of the first. Not deliberately, perhaps, but through exactly the same mechanism, assuming that what was convenient for him was acceptable for her. Assuming that Charlotte would accept whatever was offered because she was the one without the house and the land and the solicitor who'd been protecting Caldwell family assets for 30 years. He thought about what Judge Danvers had said, what Reverend Cartwright had said, what William Whitmore had written in 3 careful pages, what James Okafor had said about the doctor without accusation, just the plain fact of it. He thought about Charlotte in her aunt's kitchen in Versailles, drinking coffee she'd chosen herself, reading a book she'd chosen herself, building something that was hers. He picked up his pen and wrote a letter to William Whitmore. Not to Garrett, to Charlotte's father directly. He wrote the truth that the first proposal had been wrong and a corrected one was coming, and that Charlotte should have her own attorney review it, and he would cover whatever that cost, and he was sorry it had taken him this long to do the right thing. He sent it that afternoon. The corrected proposal went out on Friday. On Saturday morning, before he'd had his coffee, there was a knock at his front door. He opened it to find Amelia Harrington standing on his step. Not with her father this time. Alone, which was itself unusual, women of Amelia's social standing did not make unaccompanied morning calls on unmarried men, not in Woodford County, not in 1818. Which meant she was here for something important enough to risk the talk it would generate. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. She looked for the first time since he'd known her uncertain. The composure was still there. Amelia Harrington's composure was structural, built into her the way the bones of a house are built in, but underneath it, something was off. Something in the set of her eyes. "I need to speak with you," she said. "Please." He stepped back and let her in. He didn't offer the parlor. He wasn't going to make this a social occasion, and instead stood in the front hallway with his arms at his sides and waited. She took a breath. "I need to tell you something. About the night of your dinner party." He watched her. "What I said to Mrs. Danvers," she said. "About Charlotte. She stopped, started again. "I told it worse than it was. What I actually saw, what my driver told me he'd seen because I wasn't there personally, was Charlotte speaking with a man on the street in Harrodsburg. That was all. A conversation. On a public street in broad daylight, the way people have conversations." Her voice was very controlled. "I knew it was her cousin. He looked like the Whitmore family. I've seen Thomas Aldridge at county events. I knew who he was." The hallway was very quiet. "You knew," Nathaniel said. "Yes." "When you told Mrs. Danvers at my dinner party that you'd heard something concerning—" "I knew it was her cousin," Amelia said. "Yes." He let that sit between them for a long moment. He watched her face the thing underneath the composure. The thing that had made her come here alone on a Saturday morning when she had to know what it would cost her socially. "Why are you telling me this now?" he said. She looked at him with those dark, direct eyes, and he saw something in them he hadn't expected. Not guilt exactly, but something adjacent to it, something that had been keeping her up at night and had finally gotten too heavy to carry around. "Because," she said, "I went to the church in Versailles last Tuesday. I wanted to see her." A pause. "She was teaching. There was a woman older than my mother who read a sentence out loud for the first time. And Charlotte—" Amelia stopped. Her jaw tightened. Charlotte was so kind to her. She was so genuinely, naturally kind without any artifice in it at all. And she looked at the floor. "I sat in the back, and I watched, and I thought about what I'd done. And I understood that what I'd done was wrong in a way I hadn't let myself understand before." Nathaniel said nothing. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness," Amelia said. "That's not why I came. I came because—" She lifted her eyes. "I came because I think you should know the whole truth, and because I intend to tell Charlotte myself if she'll see me. But I wanted to tell you first." He studied her. "You're going to tell Charlotte." "I'm going to try." Her voice was steadier now, but only just. "I don't expect her to forgive me. I only want her to know that I understand the full weight of what I did. She lost—" Amelia's composure cracked just a fraction. "She lost her home, her position, her marriage. And I did that. I did it deliberately, and I knew what I was doing, and I did it anyway. And I need her to know that I know that." Nathaniel looked at Amelia. Harrington really looked at her the way he was learning slowly, expensively to look at things he'd previously skimmed the surface of. He saw a woman who had done a genuinely terrible thing and was now sitting with the full knowledge of it, and that was not comfortable to sit with. He knew something about that now. "All right," he said. "Then go tell her." "Will you—" She hesitated. "Would you come?" "No," he said without harshness. "This isn't mine to be present for. That's between you and Charlotte." Amelia nodded. She moved toward the door. At the threshold she stopped and said without turning around, "She's remarkable, you know. I was jealous of her for years, and I never actually let myself see what she was. I just saw what she had." A beat. "I think you did the same." She left. Nathaniel stood in his front hallway for a long moment. The Saturday morning was coming in through the window, warm and gold, and the house was quiet around him with its familiar new quality. Not empty exactly, not anymore, but still carrying the shape of absence, the way a room carries the shape of furniture that's been moved. He thought about Amelia Harrington going to Versailles to confess to a woman she'd wronged alone, without anyone making her simply because she'd sat in the back of a church and watched Charlotte be kind, and couldn't carry the weight of what she'd done anymore. He thought about what that cost, and about what it meant that Charlotte had, without knowing it, without trying, simply by being herself in a Tuesday morning reading class, provoked that reckoning. He thought, that is who she is. That is who she has always been. And I had her in this house for 3 years, and I looked through her every single day. He rode to Versailles the following Wednesday. He hadn't planned to go that day specifically. He'd been thinking about going for 2 weeks, turning it over, trying to find the right words, and then at breakfast that Wednesday morning, he'd looked at the empty chair across the table and understood that he was never going to have the right words, that the right words didn't exist, and that waiting for them was another version of the same cowardice that had gotten him here. He knocked at Ruth Whitmore's door at mid-morning. Ruth answered. She looked at him with that same steady, unhurried gaze. "Mr. Caldwell," she said. "Is Charlotte here, ma'am?" "She is." Ruth studied him for a moment. "She knows you've been making changes at the estate." He blinked. "She does." "Word gets around," Ruth said simply. "She knows about Marcus's knee. She knows about the settlement." A pause. "She knows you rewrote the proposal." "I should have written it right the first time." "Yes," Ruth said. "You should have." She held his gaze for another moment. Then she stepped aside. "She's in the back garden." He found Charlotte kneeling in the kitchen garden, doing something with the late summer plantings, putting in what looked like garlic for fall. Something his mother used to do, he remembered distantly. She heard his boots on the path and looked up. She looked well, better than well. There was color in her face from being outdoors, and she'd let some of her hair come down from its pin in a way she never would have at Caldwell House, and she looked unguarded. That was the word. She looked like a person who had stopped bracing against something. She sat back on her heels and waited. He removed his hat. He stood at the edge of the garden and he said, "I know you told me not to come back asking you to return. I'm not. That's not why I'm here." "All right," she said. "Then why are you here?" He'd had something prepared, some organized version of what he wanted to say, careful and structured the way he'd learned to structure things over years of business dealings, where clarity was a form of control. It left him entirely. "I don't know how to do this," he said. She watched him. He stopped. "I've spent the last 8 weeks trying to become something better than what I was, and I don't think I've done it yet, and I don't think I'm going to stand here and tell you I have, because you've always been able to see through me when I was performing something, and you'd see through it now." He pressed his hat between his hands. "I found out about the doctor, James Okafor's boy. That you paid for the doctor out of your own allowance and never said a word to anyone about it. Charlotte was quiet. I found out about a lot of things, he said. All the things you did that I never saw. All the ways you were in that house, really in it, with the people in it, while I was managing the property and thinking I was running things. He looked at her. I was running property, Charlotte. You were running a home. Those aren't the same thing. She set her gardening tool down in the dirt beside her. No, she said quietly. They aren't. Amelia Harrington came to see me, he said. Something shifted in Charlotte's expression. I know. She came here too. He hadn't known that. She did. Last Friday. Charlotte looked at her hands for a moment. She told me she knew Thomas was my cousin, that she'd always known. A pause. She cried. I didn't entirely expect that. What did you say to her? Charlotte was quiet for a moment. I told her I forgave her. She looked up. I meant it, not because what she did was forgivable in the abstract, but because I'm not willing to organize my life around someone else's wrong action. I forgave her, and I told her I hoped she'd use what she'd done as a reason to look at herself honestly, and then I poured her tea and she left. Nathaniel looked at her. You poured her tea, he said. She was a guest in my aunt's house. The faintest curve at the corner of Charlotte's mouth. And she was genuinely sorry, which matters. He shook his head. Not in disagreement, in something closer to awe, which he wouldn't have known how to feel 2 months ago. Charlotte, how are the accounts? She said. He blinked. What? The household accounts. Pratt figured out the system. Mostly, he said, thrown by the turn. He struggles with the quarterly supplier reconciliation. I've been checking it myself. Something in her expression softened. The quarterly reconciliation has to be done against the delivery records, not the invoices. The invoices are always a week behind. I know that now, he said. I made the error in July and traced it back. Good. She picked up her gardening tool again. How is Marcus's knee? Better. The poultice is keeping well. I've put Pratt in charge of stocking it. She nodded, looking at the garden. And Della, is she managing the kitchen all right without Mary? She hired a girl from town, young, a quick learner. Della's been good about training her. Charlotte nodded again. She was quiet for a moment, pressing the earth around something with her fingers, and Nathaniel stood at the edge of the garden and watched her, and understood that she was doing something he hadn't expected. She was checking. She was checking on the people at the estate she cared about, asking through him, because he was the only conduit she had. She'd left the house. She hadn't left the people. Charlotte, he said, I need to say something, and I need you to let me finish before you respond. She looked up. I'm sorry, he said. I've said that before, and I mean it more now than I did then, because now I understand more of what I'm sorry for. I'm sorry for believing Amelia Harrington. I'm sorry for not waiting for the truth. I'm sorry for the settlement proposal that Garrett sent, which was an insult and which I should have caught before it left my desk and didn't because I wasn't paying enough attention. He paused. I'm sorry for 3 years of not seeing you. For taking everything you gave this house and these people and treating it like furniture, like something that was simply there serving its function, not requiring acknowledgement. His voice dropped. I'm sorry I didn't learn to love you when you were there to be loved. The garden was still. Charlotte looked at him with her steady dark eyes, and he saw something move through them. Not softening exactly, not yielding, but something recognizing. The way a person looks when they hear something they have been waiting a long time to hear and weren't sure they ever would. That's the most honest thing you've ever said to me, she said quietly. I know, he said. I'm working on saying more honest things. She was quiet for a moment. Sit down, Nathaniel. He looked around. There was a low stone wall at the edge of the garden. He sat on it. She sat back on her heels at her level a few feet from him. Not the formal distance she'd maintained at his first visit. Something smaller. I've been thinking, she said, about what I want. Not what's practical, not what would be expected of me, what I actually want. She met his eyes. I've had more space to think in the last 2 months than I've had in 3 years, and I've used it. What have you decided? He said. I've decided, she said carefully, that I like my mornings. I like teaching at the church. I like sitting at my aunt's table and having opinions about things that aren't related to the fencing budget or the quarterly reconciliation. A small pause. I like being Charlotte Whitmore. He nodded. But I've also decided, she continued, that those things, those mornings, those choices, that sense of being my own person, those don't have to exist in opposition to everything else. They could exist alongside other things. If those other things were right. He held very still. I'm not saying yes, she said. I'm not saying come back. I'm not saying everything is forgiven, and we go on as before because we can't, and I wouldn't want to, even if we could. She held his gaze. But I am saying that I've watched you from the distance of 40 miles, and people's reports making different choices. And that matters to me. Not because it changes what happened, but because it suggests who you might be becoming. I'm trying, he said. I know, she said. And trying is different from doing. But it's also different from not trying at all. He turned his hat in his hands. What would you need, he said, to consider not returning, not yet, but to let me try, properly. To court you, if you'll use that word as a free woman, not as my wife, not as someone who owes me anything, just to let me show you over time who I'm working to become. Charlotte looked at him for a long, serious moment, not with calculation, with the genuine weight of someone considering something real. 3 things, she said. He waited. First, she said, my reading class continues. Whatever happens between us, that doesn't stop. It isn't a wife's pastime, it's mine. Of course, he said immediately. Second, she said, any arrangement between us, any future arrangement, is one where I have a voice in decisions. Not a polite voice that gets thanked and then ignored. An actual voice with actual weight. She paused. I will not run a house again where I am invisible. You would never be invisible to me again, he said. I swear that to you. She held his gaze, measuring the words. Then she said, third. He waited. Third, Charlotte said quietly, is that you have to tell me the truth. Whatever it is, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's something you'd rather manage than feel. Her voice was very steady. The reason this all happened, not Amelia's lie, not the rumor, but the thing underneath it, was that you couldn't tell me honestly that you were unhappy in our marriage, that you didn't know how to be in it, that you needed something different and didn't know how to ask for it. She paused. If there's ever going to be anything real between us, it has to be built on honesty, not social performance, not efficiency, honest. He was very quiet. That is the hardest of the 3 for me, he said. I know, she said. That's why I named it. He looked at her. He looked at her the way he'd failed to look at her for 3 years, not through her, not past her, not managing her presence in the room, but at her. At Charlotte Whitmore, who had written to her cousin's wife before she'd even left his house because she was practical enough to know she needed somewhere to go. Who had poured tea for the woman who'd destroyed her marriage because the woman was a guest and was genuinely sorry. Who had wept alongside a 53-year-old woman who'd written her own name for the first time. Who was kneeling in a kitchen garden in Versailles, Kentucky, on a September morning making conditions. I accept all 3, he said. She nodded. Once. The same nod she'd given him in the garden 2 months ago when she'd said she'd heard his apology, and it had mattered. But this one was different. This one had something in it that the first one hadn't. The first one had closed something. This one barely cautiously was opening something. Then, Charlotte said, you may come on Sundays, if you'd like to come. Not to the house, there's a lending library in town that's open Sunday afternoons. I go most weeks. Ruth comes sometimes and sometimes she doesn't. She tilted her head slightly. Occasionally there is room for someone else. He understood what she was offering. Not the house, not a private arrangement. A public place with space for her aunt, with her own comings and goings intact on her schedule at her invitation. Sunday afternoons, he said. Yes. I'll be there this Sunday, he said. I know you will, she said. He stood. He put his hat back on. He looked at her one more time, kneeling in the late summer garden, with her hands in the earth, and he understood that this was the real woman, not the composed woman at his dinner table, not the invisible woman in his household, but this one with the dirt on her hands, and her hair half down, and her conditions lined up like the clean rows of a well-tended garden. "Thank you," he said, "for giving me the chance." "Don't thank me yet," she said, not unkindly. "It's a Sunday at the library, Nathaniel, not a second chance. A first look at who you are now." He nodded. He turned to go. He was halfway back up the garden path when she said behind him, "The quarterly reconciliation, the one Pratt has trouble with." He stopped, turned. "Tell him to set the delivery records beside the invoices and work column by column from left to right," she said. "He keeps trying to do it by memory. It can't be done by memory. It has to be done line by line." He stood on the garden path and looked at her, and felt something happen in his chest that he didn't have a word for, and didn't try to find one. "I'll tell him," he said. "Good," she said, and went back to her planting. He rode home to Caldwell House in the September heat, and for the first time since July the 14th, it didn't feel entirely like riding back to an absence. It felt like riding back to something he was building. Something that didn't have a shape yet, that was just the earliest framing, just the suggestion of what it might become, but something that was, if he worked at it honestly and humbly and without the arrogance that had cost him everything, a thing that could be real. He told himself not to be foolish. He told himself it was a Sunday at a library, that Charlotte Whitmore owed him nothing, that she might go to the library and decide over the weeks that followed that he wasn't the man she'd need him to be, and that she'd be right to decide that, and he would have to live with it. He told himself all of that, and underneath it, stubborn and persistent as the fireflies that had still been rising from the grass the night Charlotte walked out his door, was something that felt like the careful beginning of hope. He arrived home. He went directly to find Pratt. "The quarterly reconciliation," he said. "Charlotte says the delivery records and the invoices need to be worked column by column left to right, not from memory." Pratt looked at him. "That's yes, sir, that would explain the errors I've been making." "Try it that way," Nathaniel said. "I think you'll find it straightens out." He went inside. He sat at his father's desk. He took out the pages he'd written. The honest pages, the account of himself he'd never intended for anyone's eyes, and he read them through. He looked at the man they described. He thought about the man he was trying to become. Then he put the pages away, and he picked up his pen, and he wrote to his horse trader in Lexington, and he went over the week's accounts, and he made a note to have someone look at the east fence line before the weather changed, and he did all the ordinary work of a man running a large property on a September afternoon. But at the bottom of his agenda, he wrote in handwriting that was unusually careful for a private note Sunday. Library, Versailles, 2 o'clock. He underlined it once, not for any reason he could have explained, only because it was something he had no intention of forgetting. He was there at 2 o'clock. He'd arrived at 1:30, which he recognized as embarrassing and didn't apologize for even to himself. He'd tied his horse at the post outside and gone in and found a chair near the window and picked up a book he had no intention of reading and sat there for 30 minutes waiting for the door to open. It opened at 2:05. Charlotte came in with her aunt on one side and a woman Nathaniel didn't recognize on the other, a stout, cheerful-looking woman in her 50s who was talking animatedly about something as they came through the door. Charlotte was laughing at whatever the woman had said, a full, unguarded laugh, and for a moment she didn't see him. She was just a woman walking into a library on a Sunday afternoon, laughing with people she liked wearing a green dress he hadn't seen before, and she looked so thoroughly herself that something in Nathaniel's chest contracted sharply. Then she saw him. The laugh didn't disappear exactly. It settled. She said something to her companions, and they went toward the shelves, and she crossed the room to where he was sitting. He stood, removed his hat, said, "Charlotte." "You're early," she said. "I am," he agreed. The corner of her mouth moved. "The book you're holding is upside down." He looked down. It was. He turned it right way up with a composure he did not entirely feel, and she sat down in the chair across from him, and folded her hands in her lap, and looked at him with that steady, direct gaze he was beginning to understand. He'd been afraid of for years, not because it was harsh, but because it saw. "How is the estate?" she said. Pratt worked the quarterly reconciliation column by column, he said. It balanced on the first try. She nodded, satisfied. "And Marcus?" "Nee is better. He was in the paddock Thursday moving well." He paused. "I asked him to teach the new stable hand how to read tack condition. He lit up like I'd handed him something valuable." Charlotte looked at him. That was kind. "It was practical," he said. Then more honestly, it was both. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "What are you reading?" He looked at the book in his hand. It was a volume of sermons. He set it on the table. "I wasn't reading. I was waiting." "I know," she said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite amusement, and not quite warmth, but was somewhere in the territory between them, and Nathaniel held on to it carefully, the way you hold something fragile that you are not yet sure belongs to you. They talked for an hour and a half. Not about the marriage, not about what had happened or what might happen. They talked about the books on the shelves and which ones Charlotte had read and which she hadn't been able to get to yet. And he told her about a pamphlet on crop rotation he'd read that had changed how he was thinking about the Southfield, and she asked questions about it that were genuinely informed because she'd spent 3 years listening to conversations about farming at his dinner table and had retained more than anyone had ever given her credit for. Ruth Whitmore came and sat with them for 40 minutes and said exactly what she thought about everything, which turned out to be quite a lot. And Nathaniel listened to her and responded honestly and made her laugh twice, and when Ruth left to find a specific book she'd been wanting, he saw Charlotte watching her aunt's back with an expression of quiet affection that opened something in his chest. When it was time to go, Charlotte stood and he stood, and she said, "Next Sunday, if you'd like to come again?" "I'd like to come again," he said. She nodded. She went to find her companions. He walked out into the September afternoon and stood beside his horse for a moment before mounting, and thought that was the best hour and a half he'd spent in longer than he could clearly remember. He came the next Sunday, and the one after that. By the 4th Sunday, Ruth Whitmore had stopped coming with Charlotte, which Charlotte had not mentioned in advance, and which Nathaniel suspected was deliberate on Ruth's part. By the 5th Sunday, the librarian, a small observant man named Mr. Pierce, who had been watching this arrangement unfold with the careful attention of someone who understood that he was witnessing something significant, had taken to setting aside 2 chairs near the window without being asked. Nathaniel noticed when Charlotte's posture changed. Not on a specific Sunday, but gradually over the course of the weeks, the way a thing changes when the attention being paid to it is consistent and genuine. She stopped sitting quite so upright, stopped keeping her hands quite so neatly folded, started gesturing when she talked the way she did with her aunt. The guardedness didn't disappear. It wouldn't, and he didn't expect it to, and he was glad for it, in a way that would have surprised him 2 months earlier. Her guardedness was proof that she knew her own value. He didn't want it gone. He just wanted to be the kind of man it could eventually carefully open to. He talked to her differently than he'd ever talked to her in 3 years of marriage. He didn't know when he'd started doing it, only that by the 6th Sunday, he was telling her things he hadn't told anyone about the letters he'd written to himself in his father's study, about the portrait on the wall, about standing in that room, and finally naming the feeling he'd always had looking at his father's face, about the gap between the man he'd appeared to be and the man he'd been afraid he was underneath. She listened. She didn't fill the silence with comfort or reassurance. She just listened. And when he was done, she said, "I think your father would have been glad that you finally looked at it." "Judge Danvers told me he'd be ashamed of me," Nathaniel said. "He would have been," Charlotte said, "and then glad." She paused. "Those aren't mutually exclusive." He looked at her. "How do you do that?" "Do what?" "Hold 2 things at once. the hard thing and the hopeful thing at the same time, without letting one cancel out the other. She thought about it for a moment. "I suppose," she said slowly, "because I've had a lot of practice holding things that didn't resolve neatly. And I've learned that insisting on resolution before you're ready is just another way of not paying attention." He sat with that. "I've spent my whole life insisting on resolution," he said. "I know," she said. "You were very efficient about it." There was enough dryness in it that he laughed, actually laughed, which surprised him. And she smiled at the laugh, not the composed, careful social smile he'd seen at his dinner parties, but the real one, the one that reached her eyes, and it was the first time he'd seen it directed at him, and he understood with absolute clarity that he would spend a considerable amount of the rest of his life trying to deserve it. The twist came on a Thursday 6 weeks into the Sunday arrangement, and it came from a direction he hadn't anticipated. He was in Harrodsburg at the bank when he ran into Edmund Harrington, Amelia's father. Edmund was a large, red-faced man who'd made his money in merchant trade and spent it building the social standing his daughter had been raised to expect, and he did not look pleased to see Nathaniel. He looked, in fact, like a man who had something to say and had been waiting for the opportunity. "Caldwell," he said, pulling him aside with a hand on his arm that was not quite the grip of a man making a friendly gesture. "Mr. Harrington," Nathaniel said. "I'm going to speak plainly," Edmund said. "You've made my daughter's situation very difficult." Nathaniel looked at him. "Sir, your daughter made my wife's situation considerably more difficult first." Edmund's face went redder. "Amelia made a mistake, a social mistake. Young women make social mistakes. You didn't have to what you said to her, Caldwell, at my house." "I told her the truth," Nathaniel said, "that I knew what she'd done and that I was not going to pursue any relationship with her. That was not a social attack. That was a direct statement of fact. People are talking about her." "People were talking about Charlotte," Nathaniel said quietly, "because of what Amelia did, deliberately, knowing it was a lie." He held Edmund Harrington's eyes. "I have a great deal of sympathy for the difficulty your daughter is in, Mr. Harrington. She made a choice, and she's living with its consequences. That is how choices work." Edmund stared at him. His jaw moved. "Your wife is gone," he said with the particular cruelty of a man swinging what he has. "Whatever you think you're protecting, Caldwell, she walked out your door and she isn't coming back. Half the county knows it. What exactly do you think you're preserving here?" Nathaniel looked at this man, the father of the woman who'd destroyed his marriage, standing in front of him with red in his face and anger in his eyes because his daughter was facing the social difficulty her own actions had produced, and felt something clear and calm settle over him. "I'm not preserving anything," he said. "I'm building something, and whether it succeeds or not has nothing to do with protecting my reputation or managing what the county thinks. It has to do with who I'm trying to become." He paused. "Charlotte Whitmore is not gone, Mr. Harrington. She is in Versailles, and she is thriving, and she is exactly who she has always been. The only thing that's gone is my blindness about it." He put his hat back on. "Good day, sir." He walked out of the bank and stood in the street for a moment in the autumn heat and felt not triumph, nothing as simple as that, but the particular steadiness of a man who has said something true at some cost to himself and doesn't regret a word of it. He thought, "I would have apologized to that man 2 months ago. I would have smoothed it over and managed his feelings and found a way to make the conversation end comfortably for everyone." He didn't want to do that anymore. He mounted his horse and rode toward Versailles. He hadn't planned to go that day. It wasn't Sunday. But he'd just said something true at some social cost, and he wanted Charlotte to know he'd said it, not because he needed her approval, but because she was the person he wanted to tell true things to, and that was new enough and significant enough that he wasn't going to ignore it. Ruth Whitmore opened the door and looked at him with the expression of a woman who has seen this coming and is choosing not to say so out loud. "She's at the church," Ruth said. "Her Tuesday class runs long sometimes. I'll wait if that's all right." Ruth stepped aside. She put the kettle on. He sat at her kitchen table and drank tea, Ruth's tea, which was considerably stronger than anything he'd had before, and which she offered without asking whether he wanted it the way a woman does who has decided someone is family, and family doesn't get asked whether they want tea. And he told Ruth what had happened with Edmund Harrington at the bank. Ruth listened. She didn't interrupt. When he was done, she turned her cup in her hands and said, "And how did it feel saying it?" "Like the right thing," he said. "Even though it'll cost me with the Harringtons." "Some costs are worth paying," Ruth said. "Charlotte said that to me once," he said. "Not in those words, but that's what she meant." Ruth looked at him with those direct, patient eyes. "She'll be home inside the hour," she said. "You can stay for supper if you'd like." He stayed for supper. Charlotte came in from the church still talking, carrying the momentum of whatever the class had been working on that day, some bright energy in her face that he'd been seeing more and more on Sundays, and hadn't quite seen, directed at a room he was also in. She stopped when she saw him at the table. "It's Thursday," she said. "I know," he said. "Something happened today I wanted to tell you." She set her things down. She sat across from him. He told her about Edmund Harrington. She listened, the way she always listened, not waiting for him to finish so she could respond, but actually taking it in the way she took everything in. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment. "He said she's not coming back," Charlotte said. "Yes." "What did you say?" "I said you were in Versailles and thriving and exactly who you'd always been." He paused. "And that the only thing that was gone was my blindness." Charlotte looked at him across her aunt's kitchen table for a long moment. Something was happening in her expression that he couldn't quite read. Something that was moving past the careful, measured quality she'd maintained in all their Sunday conversations, something more unguarded. "Nathaniel," she said. "Yes." "Why did you come today? The real reason, not the Edmund Harrington story." He looked at her. He thought about efficient answers, about socially managed answers, about all the answers that would present him well and give nothing away and protect him from the particular vulnerability of being honest with a person who could see him clearly. He said, "Because you're the person I wanted to tell it to. Because when something true happens, you're who I think of." The kitchen was very quiet. Ruth Whitmore, who had been moving around at the stove, with the practiced invisibility of a woman who has been a third party in meaningful conversations before, set a dish on the counter and went into the other room without saying a word. Charlotte kept looking at him. "All right," she said. "All right, Nathaniel." It wasn't yes. He knew that. But it was something that had moved, and he could feel it, and he didn't push it. And they ate Ruth's supper, and talked about nothing of consequence, and it was the best evening he'd had in years. October came in cool, and with it something shifted in the Sunday visits. They walked sometimes after the library down the main street of Versailles in the autumn afternoon, stopping at the bakery where Charlotte knew the woman behind the counter and introduced him without ceremony. Just his name, not his title, not his property. Just Nathaniel, which was the first time anyone had introduced him that way since childhood, and which landed with an intimacy he hadn't expected. He bought her a piece of apple cake. She ate it without the careful social restraint he'd seen her apply to food at dinner parties for 3 years. Just ate it with genuine pleasure, and he watched her and felt 8 kinds of fool for all the mornings and evenings he'd sat across a table from this woman and not paid attention. He started writing to her. Not long letters, he wasn't a man of florid expression, and she wouldn't have wanted it, but short notes, 2 or 3 times a week about things that made him think of her. The way Pratt finally got the quarterly reconciliation right, and stood looking at the balanced columns like a man who has performed a small miracle. The way James Okafor had taught his son to saddle a horse that week, and Nathaniel had watched from a distance, and thought about what it meant to pass something on, to take the time to teach someone something, because you cared whether they knew it. He wrote about his father's portrait, and how he'd finally been able to look at it for a full minute without looking away. Charlotte wrote back. Her notes were longer than his. She wrote about the women in her Tuesday class with specificity and affection, their names what they were working on, the small victories that were large to them. She wrote about a book she'd found in the lending library that had kept her up past midnight, and about the conversation she'd had with Ruth about it the next morning. She wrote in the fourth note something that was so simply stated, it stopped him cold. I think I had forgotten in the years at your house that I had things to say. It is strange and good to remember it. He read that note 3 times. Then he wrote back, I am sorry I made a house where you forgot. I will spend the rest of my life, if you will allow it, making somewhere you remember. She didn't respond to that directly. But the following Sunday she sat closer to him in the library than she had before, their chairs almost touching. And when she handed him a book she'd been recommending for 2 weeks, her hand brushed his, and neither of them moved away. He understood they were getting somewhere. He didn't name it. He let it move at its own pace, the way you let land recover, not forcing it, not impatient, trusting the process, because you've finally learned enough to know that trust is part of the tending. The moment he hadn't planned for came on a Sunday in early November, when the air had gone cold and the trees were stripped, and Charlotte arrived at the library with color in her cheeks from the walk and sat down across from him and said before he could say anything, I want to show you something. She reached into her bag and took out a folded piece of paper and held it out to him. He took it, unfolded it. It was a letter, written in a careful, slightly uneven hand, the hand of someone learning, working at it, taking their time with each letter. It said, My name is Grace. I am 53 years old. I learned to read with Mrs. Whitmore. She is kind. I am not afraid anymore. He looked up. Grace Patterson, Charlotte said. She's been in my class since September. She could not read a word when she came in. She wrote this letter to give to me last Tuesday. Her voice was steady, but something in it was full and her eyes were bright. She asked me if I thought it was good. I told her it was the finest letter I'd ever received. Nathaniel looked down at the letter again. The careful, uneven letters. I am not afraid anymore. He looked up at Charlotte and said, Is this what it's like? What? Teaching them. Is this what it's like every time? Not every time, she said honestly. Some days are hard and slow, and the progress is invisible. But sometimes, she looked at the letter in his hands. Sometimes it's exactly like this. You were made for this, he said. She didn't deflect it. She didn't say something modest and redirect. She just looked at him and said, Yes, I think I was. That was the moment. He recognized it even as it was happening, not a dramatic moment, not large, not the kind of moment that announces itself. Just Charlotte Whitmore sitting across from him in a library in Versailles, Kentucky in November, accepting without apology that she was good at something and that it mattered. He said, Charlotte, I would like to ask you something. She looked at him. Not today, he said. Not right now. I'm not asking it today because I think we need more Sundays and more honest letters and more time, and I'm not going to rush this because rushing things is what I have always done, and it has cost me everything. He held her gaze. But I want you to know that I intend to ask it, and I want you to know what the answer I'm hoping for is. Her expression was very still. Nathaniel, I'm not asking you back to the house, he said. I'm not asking you to be Mrs. Caldwell again. I'm asking whether in time when we've both done enough of the work that the question makes sense to ask whether you would consider building something new with me. Not what we had. Something better. Something where you are not invisible and I am not performing, and where your reading class and your Grace Pattersons and your Tuesday mornings and your opinions about books are not exceptions to the marriage, but part of it. He paused. That's what I'm going to ask. I just wanted you to know I was going to ask it. The library was quiet. Outside, a gust of November wind hit the window. Charlotte looked at him for a long time. Then she said, You're really not going to ask it today? No, he said, not today. She looked down at Grace Patterson's letter still in his hands and back up at him. Then I suppose, she said carefully, I'll have to keep coming on Sundays until you do. He heard what she meant. He heard it precisely. He felt it move through him like the first warm day after a long winter which he had not expected in this cold library on a November afternoon. That's all I needed to know, he said quietly. She held out her hand for Grace's letter. He gave it back to her, and as she took it, her fingers wrapped around the paper and the edge of his hand for just a moment, and neither of them made anything of it, and it was the most honest touch he could ever remember. He asked her in December. He didn't make a production of it. He'd thought about grand gestures and dismissed them. Charlotte Whitmore had never needed grand gestures, had always been more moved by the small, consistent thing than the dramatic one, and he'd learned enough to know that by now. He asked her on a Sunday in the library in the chairs by the window that Mr. Pierce had long since stopped setting out and simply left for them as a matter of course. He said, "I'd like to ask you now if you're willing." She put her book down. "I'm willing," she said. He didn't go to one knee. He sat across from her and looked at her directly and said, "Charlotte Whitmore, I would like to marry you. Not to take you back, not to restore what was. I would like to marry you as the woman you are right now, the woman who teaches reading on Tuesdays and has opinions about crop rotation and writes back to my letters and holds two things at once without letting one cancel out the other." He paused. "I would like to marry a woman I actually see, and I would like to spend the rest of my life making sure she knows she's seen." Charlotte looked at him. He waited. She said, "There are conditions." "There are always conditions," he said. "Name them." "The reading class doesn't stop." "I'll build you a proper schoolroom," he said, "on the estate grounds, big enough for 20 students if you want them." Something moved through her eyes. "The staff at the house, Marcus Della James Okafor and his crew, they are people, not property. They get asked how they're doing. They get what they need to work with dignity. That is not optional." "It was never optional," he said. "I just didn't know that yet. I know it now." "If we disagree," she said, "we talk about it. You don't manage me. You don't decide for me. We talk." "We talk?" he agreed. She was quiet for a moment. He held himself very still the way he'd learned to hold himself these past months, not reaching, not pushing, just present, just honest, just there. "And the house," she said quietly. "If I come back to that house, I need it to feel like mine, not like a position I'm occupying. Mine." "It is yours," he said. "It should have been from the beginning. That was my failure. It won't be again." Charlotte Whitmore looked at Nathaniel Caldwell across 2 library chairs, and 4 months of Sundays, and 3 years of a marriage that had been less than it should have been, and 5 months of becoming something more. And she made her decision the way she made all her decisions, not impulsively, not fearfully, but with the full weight of her own judgment behind it. "Yes," she said. One word, quiet, absolute, entirely hers. He exhaled. He'd been holding something for months and didn't know it until it let go. "Charlotte." "There's one more thing," she said. He waited. She reached into her bag and took something out and held it on her palm. It was the gold bracelet. The thin one from their first anniversary, the one she'd left on the dressing table when she packed her bag in July. He'd put it in the drawer, and he hadn't known she knew about that, but she must have because it was in her hand. "I went back to the house," she said. "Last week when you were in Harrodsburg, Ruth came with me. I wanted to—" She paused. "I wanted to see it with different eyes, to see whether it was somewhere I could come back to. And—" his voice was very quiet. "And I went upstairs," she said. "And I found the drawer." She looked at the bracelet in her hand. "You put it away. You took care of it." "Yes," he said. "Why?" He thought about the right answer and said the true one instead. "Because it was yours. And because taking care of things you care about is what you do even when the person they belong to isn't there." He paused. "I was learning from you, even when you were gone." She closed her hand around the bracelet. She looked at it for a moment, then she held it out to him. Not to keep. He understood immediately she held it out for him to put on her wrist, which he did carefully. His fingers working the small clasp in the November cold library, while she held still. And Mr. Pierce pretended to be completely absorbed in his catalog on the other side of the room. When the clasp was closed, he kept her hand for a moment, just a moment, and she let him. "All right," Charlotte said. Her voice was steady and warm and entirely certain. "Let's go home." They married in the spring. Not the grand affair that Caldwell estate weddings were expected to be. Charlotte had made clear she wanted something small, honest. Just their people. And their people turned out to include Ruth Whitmore and Reverend Cartwright and Della from the kitchen, and old Marcus who wore his good coat and stood in the back with his knee almost entirely healed, and James Okafor and his family, and 12 women from Charlotte's Tuesday reading class. 6 of whom had never been inside a church for a ceremony before, and sat in the front rows with a gravity and happiness that made the thing feel Nathaniel thought more real than any dinner party he'd ever given. Grace Patterson was there. She wore a blue dress and sat in the second row, and when Charlotte walked in, she pressed her hands together and her lips moved, and Nathaniel suspected she was reading the prayer card in her lap by herself, without help. Reverend Cartwright kept the words simple because Charlotte had asked him to. He said the things that were true, that marriage was a choice, renewed daily, that love was less a feeling than a practice, that 2 people standing here were not promising to be perfect, but promising to keep looking at each other honestly for as long as they lived. When Cartwright asked Charlotte if she took this man, she turned to look at Nathaniel directly and said, "I do," in the clearest voice he'd ever heard from her. Not the careful, measured voice of a woman being appropriate. The voice of a woman making a free choice with her whole self behind it. He said it back with everything he had. Ruth Whitmore cried and claimed afterward that she did not, and nobody argued with her about it because she was Ruth Whitmore, and she could cry if she wanted to, and call it whatever she liked. After, in the evening, when the guests had gone, and the house was quiet in the particular way it was quiet now, not the absence quiet of the months after Charlotte had left, but a different quiet, inhabited and warm and full of the small sounds of a place that is being lived in. Charlotte stood in the kitchen making tea because she'd sent Della home hours ago, and she wanted to make it herself. And Nathaniel stood in the doorway watching her, and thought about everything that had happened in the 9 months since July. He thought about the herb garden, and the ring left by the door. He thought about the library, and Grace Patterson's letter, and the bracelet clasp in the cold. He thought about all the small, expensive lessons that had gotten him to this doorway, to this kitchen, to this woman making tea in her own house on her own terms. Charlotte turned and found him watching her. "You're staring," she said. "I am," he agreed. "Any particular reason?" "I'm paying attention," he said. "I'm told I should do more of it." She looked at him for a moment, and the smile that came across her face was the real one, the one he'd been working to deserve, and she held out the cup. He crossed the kitchen and took it. Their hands met around the warm ceramic and stayed there. "Charlotte," he said. "Yes." "I see you." She held his eyes. She heard it the way he meant it, not as a thing a man says to a woman because it sounds right, but as the truest and most complete sentence he knew how to offer. The thing that had taken him 32 years and the most costly mistake of his life to learn. "I know," she said. "I know you do." Outside, the spring evening was coming in off the Kentucky hills, carrying the smell of new grass and creek water and everything beginning again. Inside, the kitchen was warm and the tea was hot, and the woman standing across from him had chosen him freely with her whole self and her full judgment and all her conditions intact. And Nathaniel Caldwell understood with absolute clarity that this was the only success in his life that had ever mattered. He had not won her back. He had become worthy of her choice, and Charlotte Whitmore, who had walked out of this house with nothing but her mother's Bible and 3 years of invisible strength and the stubborn, unbreakable knowledge of her own worth, had returned to it not because she needed to, not because she had nowhere else to go, not because a man had asked and she had run out of reasons to say no, but because she had chosen with everything she was to say yes. That was the difference. That was everything.